I work for a company called CookPad. I started life off as a chemical engineer and decided that the industries that you end up as a chemical engineer in, so pharmaceuticals, food manufacturing, and energy and oil and gas are really horrible industries. And was like, oh my God, what's going on? And around the same sort of time, there were really interesting companies coming out of the woodwork that were technology companies trying to solve the same problems. So a company like Tesla in the energy company, Solar City, Fitbit as another example in sort of pharmaceuticals and health. So I was like, right, how do I get into technology? So I threw myself into that, started a company, left that after 2 years. It didn't work, I didn't make any money. And then worked for a startup, an e-commerce startup after that. And then I found my way into CookPad. So to give you a little bit of background around CookPad, so CookPad is the world's largest recipe sharing platform. We started in Japan 20 years ago, and in Japan we're a household name. So essentially, if you ask anyone in Japan, technology companies, they'll tell you Google, Yahoo, because Yahoo's still really big in Japan, and CookPad. And essentially, the company started with a mission, which is to change the way that people think about food and eating. And the way to do that is to actually change the way that people think about cooking. Because if people really understand how to cook and they really enjoy that, then they understand where the foods come from, understand how to be healthy, and can have an impact on themselves and their family and everyone else in society. And so our mission is basically to make everyday cooking fun. We're now 100 million users. We're in 60 countries and 25 languages. There's 4 million recipes, and our goal is to be number one in the sort of food and drink space in 100 countries by 2021. And the way that the company's structured at the moment is Japan looks after itself, and then the rest of the other 59 countries are looked after in Bristol. So the founder has moved to Bristol, and the product at the moment sort of looks a little bit like this. Unfortunately, somehow my face ended up on the Play Store listing. And so essentially, it's a place for people to share recipes and also to share ideas around cooking. And we're sort of moving into a sort of tighter space, which is actually sharing your ideas around everyday cooking and sharing the things you discover every time you cook. So every time you cook, you actually learn something new. So we're trying to help leverage sharing that part of the product. So this is a little bit how it looks today. But obviously, we're trying to move as quickly as possible. And the team in Bristol is actually trying to create the next version of this recipe sharing product for a global market. So we can't touch Japan. That product's on the Nikkei. So it's sort of making all the revenue. And the founder and the CEO made the decision of basically making the global product separate. So we're in startup mode, trying to find how to make this product global. And as I said, we're based in Bristol. There's around 110 of us now, I think, in these offices in Bristol. And this is kind of the core product and design and engineering teams. We've got people from around the world. We've got some other offices around the world as well. But in terms of what I do and what my focus is, so I'm currently really heavily focused in this part of the world. So this is Indonesia, which happens to be the fourth largest population in the world, which I didn't know until about 8 months ago. It's also one of the fastest growing. And it's also one of the most interesting technology-wise. And outside of Japan, this is our biggest market. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to monetize Indonesia. So that's kind of my job. So my job is actually to make Indonesia profitable by the end of the year. No pressure. So basically, that's a bit of background. So just sort of get into it. So building products is really hard, really, really hard. And as a product manager, basically, you're responsible for three things. So assessing opportunities. So basically deciding what opportunities to go after. Is this opportunity for new revenue? Is it opportunity to create new value? Is it opportunity to create a new product, move into a new market? And then it's deciding what to build. Okay, so you've found an opportunity you want to solve, or a problem you want to solve, and then it's deciding what it is you're going to build. So what's the solution? What direction you're going to take? What's the strategy? And then essentially, then you work with a team, so the product team, engineers, designers, to basically build that product and ensure its health across the product lifecycle. But what you tend to hear about a lot in talks is sort of the third part, where people are talking about the way teams work or iterations they make. But what you don't really hear about is taking some idea from scratch, spotting an opportunity, and then building it out. So hopefully I can talk you through my last 8 months and kind of how we've done that. And when you're doing it from scratch, it seems absolutely impossible. And basically, we operate in this realm of uncertainty as product managers. So as designers, your medium is design tools. So it might be Sketch, it might be sketching, it might be creating mock-ups or whatever else. As engineers, you work in code. Product, you basically have to navigate this mess. And so the best way to do it, and to avoid this situation, so how many of you have been in this meeting? So basically everyone's arguing about what it is you should build, what the problem is that we're trying to solve, and everything else. And this kind of wastes a lot of time. And I hate this meeting. I usually walk out of this meeting, and people have got used to the fact that I walk out of this meeting now, that they know how much I hate it. But essentially the way that we work and the way that we navigate that is we just test it. So there's no ego, there's no arguing about solutions. We just test it. And we test it as quickly as possible. And what that actually means in terms of testing is, when we talk about speed, and we talk about speed a lot at CookPad, is reducing the time to learning. So to navigate that realm of uncertainty, you've basically got to learn as quickly as possible. Learn from your users, learn from the market, learn from the space, learn from the idea that you've put in front of a customer's hands. And so to kind of illustrate this idea of testing really quickly, I'm going to talk you through sort of what I've been up to for the last 6 to 8 months. So as I mentioned, my focus has been Indonesia. Our monetization model in Japan is a really interesting one, where we actually monetize our search. 2 million people subscribe to a popularity-based search in Japan. And what that means is, when you're looking for a recipe to cook any day of the week, you can get access to the best recipes that the community have tried out. So the most popular recipes, but it's actually the ones that people have tried out. So if you're familiar with something like Medium, where the best articles are behind the paywall, it's kind of a similar model to that. And what we're trying to create is this kind of top-of-mind place to come and find a recipe multiple days of the week in Indonesia. And the opportunity we spotted, so this is number one, product role, is that when people are looking for something to eat, in Indonesia, it's very different to the UK or the Western world. You don't get a weekly shop. You can't have your Tesco's delivery. And a lot of people don't have fridges, for example, so they can't keep fresh goods. So typically what happens is people do this daily shop. And what's really incredible is you have this sort of setup everywhere. Like, this is a car park, and you get amazingly fresh fruit and vegetables every day. So there's this kind of daily planning cycle, which is, what are we going to have tomorrow? So that was the opportunity that we thought we'd go after. So this is after a couple of weeks of research. And I'll start at the end to sort of explain where we got to, and then take you through it. And what we ended up with is essentially, because people are doing this daily plan rather than what are we going to have this week, we created this part of the product where essentially you can add up to 3 items in sort of a playlist of the things you're going to cook next. And this little thing follows you around the app. And then essentially what you can do is you can see those when you come back to the app, and you can decide whether you've cooked it or not. So you can basically declare if you've cooked it. And then those all end up in this list of the things that you've cooked. And what we found is that basically this is kind of mapping to your cooking brain. So usually when you're deciding what to cook, you're storing all of these things in short-term memory, like, oh, I'm going to Tesco's, I'm going to buy X, Y, and Z. And then when you're actually deciding what it is you're going to cook, you're either going to search for a new recipe, or you might kind of go back to your repertoire. But your brain can't hold very many things in it at any one time. So what this is long-term storage, and this is short-term storage. It's pretty much the idea. So that was kind of where we got to. And there's sort of 10 principles that we sort of built along the way of going through this process and actually creating this thing. So has anyone read the book Sprint? Yeah, so I stole that from Sprint. So the idea of this concept from Sprint is actually kind of built on this idea of lean methodology, which is testing, build, test, repeat as quickly as possible. And there's a book called The Lean Startup, which basically advocated this idea of building something, launching it, and then learning. But as time's gone on, this is quite expensive, so it could take days or weeks for an engineer to build a product. So basically, how can we come up with an idea and test it within the space of a few days to see whether it's something worth building, so actually worth committing engineering time to. So this is kind of this idea of reducing loop length, and a design sprint actually helps you do that. So there's a sort of methodology of 5 days where you come up with an idea and test it within the space of 5 days. So that's exactly what we did, because there's a book, so we followed it. And so I went out to Jakarta and worked with the team for 5 days, and we basically came up with that concept that you just saw. So at the end of the week, it looked like that. And that was the first iteration, which doesn't look too different to kind of what was eventually launched. So this came out of basically this format of doing sort of detailed deep dive into expert interviews, and then building something and testing it within the space of 5 days with 5 users. And then what usually happens, and you hear this story quite a lot, is that after the sprint, basically everyone's like this, and nothing happens to the idea or the product or anything else. So me and the team were trying to work out how can we keep up that cadence and actually build on the thing that we know is really valuable. So we came out of that user test with 5 people saying that they'd love it, basically. So what do we do to kind of keep accelerating? And another book, has anyone read this book? This is also a great product book. So this is a book by Marty Kagan called Inspired. If you've not read this book, go read it, it's amazing. So we were really lucky enough to have Marty in the office about 2 weeks before I went to Jakarta. So this is a bit of serendipity, I think. But there's a line in his book which is saying the best product teams basically are doing 10 to 20 iterations per week. So I came out of the sprint thinking, that sounds like a good challenge. How do we do that? Which was a bit mental, but we got there. So what we did is we basically took the sprint framework and tried to make it a bit more sustainable and less investment heavy from having to have. So that's a very expensive week. So you've got a CEO from Japan, myself, researchers, engineers. It's quite an expensive operation. So essentially, how can we do this in a more lightweight way between product and design and maybe a couple of engineers? And the key thing is to basically test and learn as quickly as possible. So this is the kind of cadence we work on at the moment. So basically starting at the end again, we basically force ourselves to test. We set ourselves a deadline, which is we get 5 users to come in, and we give ourselves 5 days or 3 days sometimes, and we go, right, there are people coming in, we have to do something. And we try and do this on a weekly cycle. And then what we do at the beginning of the week is we take what we learned from the previous week, or from the previous test, or from the research, or whatever thing else is, and we synthesize those learnings really quickly into something that we can use in the next iteration. We create these HMW, if you've not read Sprint, is how might we. So it's how might we make it clearer that this is about buying a recipe, or make it clearer that X, Y, and Z, or how might we make this part of the experience a bit more usable. So there's various things. And then we start sketching. So that's the space of 1 day. Then what we do on sort of a Tuesday is we will start testing UX, but we usually try and do this internally, or we use usertesting.com, because what we're trying to really focus on is the thing we're building valuable. So we try and get the UX bit out of the way as quickly as possible. And usually we can get away with doing that by either guerrilla testing, usertesting.com, taking the prototype to finance because they've not got any influence on the product. So if you give a finance person or an accountant a product and they can't use it, you've probably failed. Then we iterate on that feedback. And then what we do is we have a network of community managers in each of the regions globally that kind of look after the community and run offline events and that sort of thing. But I've done this before where you use the support team, basically anyone who's really, really close to the customer, who really understands the customer. And you basically run the test as if you were testing on the 5 users, but with someone who's really close to the customer. Then iterate on that feedback and then test on the Friday. So that's kind of how we work. We really focus on value rather than usability. And to give you an example of that, we came out of that sprint and did a couple of quick iterations, but then we built a beta app within the space of a week that we put out to a group of about 100 users, I think. And this was really risky, but actually when focusing on value, it's actually really important to sort of take some shortcuts and focus on the real thing. So we built it in a week. There's one engineer. We tested all the UX in a day. We just basically sat there, ran through it ourselves, ran through it with as many people as possible and made sure it made sense. And then the really risky bit was all of it was stored on the client. So if someone deleted their app, all their data was gone. But the really fun part about that is someone did do that, and they were like, I want it back. So we were like, we knew it was good. Then what we do, so we come out of something like that, so that's a beta, and then we synthesize that feedback really quickly. So this is like a Monday. And the way that we do this is we basically listen, we sit in a user interview, or we listen to a beta feedback or a survey or whatever, and we basically just write post-its of all the things that we've heard. So basically what we've heard. And we do it in its rawest form. I think, were you in the room when I tried to do this? Yeah. So this is possible to do in 20 minutes. Thor can prove that it is, because I did this at a conference. Basically, what we've heard, you then group those into themes. So basically, if you do this with a group of people, people will tend to see the same things. So you start to group things into certain things. So this might come from one person from here, this might come from another person, and then you can start to group them into sort of themes. And then what we do is we say, okay, from those themes, what are the things that are going to make the biggest impact? And so we say, basically, what's next? So essentially, how might we? So in this example, how might we, this is so long ago that I can't remember, how might we capitalize on like this idea of go-to recipes, so my favorite recipes. So some of the feedback we got was that's the way that he described that list of cooked recipes, so how can we capitalize on that? And when you're going this quickly, it's really easy to get stuck and sort of get creative block. So one way that we kind of get around this is we do this thing called diverge and converge, which is like a classic double diamond thing, if any of you are into design thinking. But basically, do as many iterations of the same thing as possible really quickly, and then converge on the ones that start to make sense. So this is the output of like maybe the 4 hours. So the first maybe couple of hours were basically sketching. Then you've got like 50 versions of the same thing. And then we ended up with 4. I think we then tested 4 and ended up with 1. And what this is basically you've got your 3 recipes in your little playlist. How do you remove one? Now obviously when you're doing a value test, you don't even think about this sort of stuff. So when you come to build it, you have to work that stuff out. So within the space of a day, we went from that mess to that, which is actually live in the product still. And then number 5 is that this idea when you're working really quickly and really focusing on value, it's really easy to end up back in that meeting where you start arguing about what color the button should be, how should this thing react, what's the interaction, etc., etc. So the way that we got around this is we basically set up, some companies use design systems, so they have an in-house system saying these are the styles, these are the colors, everything else. We didn't really have a good one, So we went to this place, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the Bible, which is, I'll go faster, which is material.io, and this is basically Google's material guidelines. And essentially what you can do here is just find how any type of interaction or button should work on Android. Really important part of prototyping, which is what this is all about, is learning. So if you don't test it, it's not a prototype. It's something you may as well stick on the wall or put on the fridge or something else. So basically the idea is to learn as quickly as possible. So everything gets tested. Here's a really great example. We thought that was the best way to show all the recipes you've cooked and the progress you've made. When we showed that to people, they went, oh my God, what's going on? I don't understand. And we ended up with something really simple, which was the thing on the right. We loved that, but everyone else hated it. Testing the extremes. So the one thing you can do in this format where you're testing with a prototype is you're testing to have insight and to learn, not necessarily to build the thing. And what that means is you can test things that are really expensive to build really quickly. So we had this idea of this little tray that you can add recipes to, and we said, oh, recommendations could be exciting. What if you put one recipe in the tray, we can recommend you a load of other recipes to go with it. And so we made a prototype that basically tested that extreme, which was you have 3 recipes of a meal, and then we basically do like a Russian roulette of recipes that show up. And we found that this is rubbish because people have to decide what to cook based on what's in their fridge, what their family likes, what they're feeling like. This context for recommendations doesn't work. If we'd built that, we would have probably spent 6 months. Picking the right medium, this is really, really important. So again, trying to move quickly, we start really lo-fi really first, and then we go more hi-fi depending on what we're testing. So lo-fi, this is actually the same part of the product. So this is our search results page. And we started like this on paper, partially to try and get our heads around what was going on, and also work with the engineers. So that's what I'm doing here to test out whether this is actually buildable. And then when we actually tested something with users, we actually had to make something a bit more interactive because the carousels are a really important part of this UI. So we don't always go that hi-fi, and we sometimes do things taking photographs of paper post-it notes or even testing with paper post-it notes. It just really depends on what you're trying to learn. This is one, again, to move really quickly. When you're working in a team trying to build something, people's contexts can't get their heads around what the other person's trying to communicate. So you end up back in that meeting at the beginning. I thought this, oh, you didn't understand me, etc., etc. So there's a reason that human beings made cave paintings, which is that people understand things visually a lot simpler. So don't explain what you're trying to say, draw it. So we have this rule. There's paper everywhere. This was the same results page that our designer was trying to explain to me, trying to explain how the content would sit on it. I had literally no idea what he was on about until he drew this, and he was like, yeah, there's some carousels, and then there's a bit that sits on top of the card. And then the last part, which is really, really important, is when you're starting something from scratch and testing out an idea, is actually really to start really, really small. So this is kind of like where you were. So like starting really small and really focusing on like those core users that you start to test with. So in that first beta, we actually only ended up with about 15 people who sort of engaged in that beta group, but they absolutely fell in love with it, and we iterated around those people. And what you can see here is usage of that part of the product every day from 3 users. And so we basically were looking for this sort of heartbeat where we could see that we were creating something really valuable that they kept coming back to every day. And we work with them, work really closely. Rather ironically, one of the beta users we signed up on the Indonesian product lives in Exeter, so you might recognize this as John Lewis. So it saved me a few plane trips. So we worked really closely with them and basically help build the right product for them. And if we can do that, then we can scale it. So to sort of summarize, and this is hopefully the takeaways that you can take. So the idea is to reduce loop length which is reducing the time to learn. Focus on value before you focus on usability, feasibility, and all of those other things. Synthesize feedback fast is this idea of what we heard, what does it mean, what next. If you get stuck, do this double diamond, diverge and converge. Use a design system so you don't argue about what color the button is. Test everything, otherwise it's not a prototype. Test the extremes because you'll learn a lot quicker that way. Pick the right medium, start lo-fi first. If you're getting in a debate, draw it, don't explain it. No one knows what you mean until you draw it on a post-it note. And then really importantly, really focus on making a really great product and experience for those people who you start working with. And as a bit of a bonus, I consider everything that I do now a prototype, including this talk. So what I can do, if there are any questions while I'm doing that, if anyone fancies just going to that and giving me a little bit of feedback, that means the next time I give this talk, I can give a better one. Cool. Thank you.